All right, welcome everybody. I am John Haigh. I'm the co-director of the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And this is another one in our series of seminars. We're extremely fortunate today. We have with us Mike Posner. And he has written a book, which we're going to raffle off at the end of this, Conscious Cat Incorporated, Pursue Profits While Protecting Human Rights. And I can imagine that this is I do believe this is a actually particularly critical issue at the moment. I want to welcome everybody that's online. I understand we have a very large number of people online. A couple of things about Mike that I want to mention. He is the Jerome Kohlberg Professor of Ethics and Finance at NYU's Stern School of Business. So he has a nice blend of both a business perspective, but also thinking about these issues in terms of a human rights lens. He's the director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at the school, the first ever human rights center at a business school. So interesting. He also has an aspect that is one of the things we really appreciate about people who speak and faculty at the Kennedy School, which is he has practical experience, not just academic experience. Prior to joining Stern, he served in the Obama administration from 2009 to 2013 as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And from 1978 to 2009, he led Human Rights First, a New York-based human rights advocacy organization. So he has both been engaged in this from a practical perspective and from as a practitioner, not just as an academic. He also has been a strong voice, a prominent voice, and a number of individuals have commented to me in the past about his influence and role in kind of shaping some of these issues. He prior to joining Human Rights First, he was a lawyer at Sonnenschein, Nath, and Rosenthal in Chicago, and he has his JD from Berkeley and a BA from the University of Michigan. So with that, we're going to open it up. Get your questions ready because we're going to open it up to questions. And Victoria, you'll help us if there are questions that come up online. Mike's going to talk for 5, 10, 15 minutes, but then we're really going to open it up to questions. I certainly have some questions I want to raise, and I suspect many of you do too. So look at this more as a conversation than as anything else at this point. So.
John, thank you.
Oh, one thing I did want to mention, Mike and I actually a few years back put together a group of about, 12 people? And we thought that Section 230 of the statute regulating social media companies needed some attention. And we wrote a piece to the Biden administration on how they should be changing Section 230 and more generally regulating social media. So one of the aspects of his book that I find interesting is his perspective on some of these issues around technology in particular and things like social media and kind of the implications for addressing, dealing with, observing, measuring human rights abuses and issues.
John, thank you for having me. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to just say a few words about the book and what it represents and sort of where I'm hoping discussions will go. It's aimed in part at encouraging business schools to make human rights a bigger part of what they do. I came to Stern, as John says, about 12 years ago, and we've set up a center, 10 people or so, and we're focused on social media, all the issues relating to what we call technology and democracy. We also are doing quite a bit of work, and the book reflects on global supply chains, issues relating to labor, both in manufacturing, mining, issues relating to migrant workers. And then we have a third stream of work, which is focused on the investment community. We've looked at ESG, DEI, a range of issues relating to the investment community. We're in the process of pulling together a report now on private equity and healthcare, and looking at the model of private equity as it applies to an essential social service. The theory of what we're doing is, and the theory of our center is that we're pro-business, but we want high standards. I believe that the globalized economy has been good for the world. It's lifted 2 billion people out of poverty. If you look, for example, at East Asia, in 1980, 77% of people living in that region were living below the poverty level, the extreme poverty level. Now, essentially, and this is really a China story more than anything else, poverty has been dramatically reduced. It's several percent now as opposed to 77%. That's a move from rural to urban, from farming to manufacturing and service. But that's a positive development for human rights. And now we have to figure out what are the guardrails, what are the rules of the road for big companies in particular in this globalized economy. That's what the book is about. That's what our center is doing. And I would just say a couple of other things by way of introduction. We live in a world where I want to live in a world where every government protects its own people. The moment that happens, I'm going to go out of business. I'll retire and do something else. We don't live in that world. We live in a world where the vast majority of people are living in countries where their own governments are either unable, don't have the resources, or unwilling to do what's needed to protect their own people. Sometimes those governments are part of the problem. And so we have a governance gap. And in the midst of that governance gap, you have giant companies from the United States, from Europe, Japan, elsewhere, coming in to do business. That's part of a globalized economy. It's cheaper to produce things. They're looking for raw materials, for minerals that are in other parts of the world. And inevitably, those companies are going to be asked to do something relating to human rights. The human rights regime that was created in the 1940s and 50s by the UN was about governments. But in the last 20 or 30 years, it's inevitably brought companies in. They weren't part of the negotiations. They didn't draft the treaties. And yet, whether they intended or not, the expectation is that they're going to be implicated, whether it's Walmart producing cheap clothing in Bangladesh, whether it's Tesla or Volkswagen extracting cobalt for batteries to fuel their electric vehicles, whether it's Meta going to Burma, Myanmar, or India, or any place in the world where their services are being used and there are issues relating to the manner in which they operate. And so this is really a moment, I think, and especially today, where these issues are playing out, and it's really a question of what's the role of government, what's the role of the private sector, how do they interact? Last comment. As the United States, certainly under this administration, moves away from a regulatory model and moves towards a more kind of transactional model, the Europeans are moving the other direction. Slowly, not directly, not linear, but there are a range of things happening now. Due diligence initiative that the European Union has introduced, now deferred for 2 years, but it's going to happen. Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, involving technology, really a dozen or so regulatory efforts where the European Union is saying, we need to be involved in regulating this global marketplace. And so companies are now trying to figure out how do they navigate a US administration that's saying all bets are off, you can do what you want. While on the other side, because they're doing business in Europe, the Europeans are moving to this regulatory model. And so this discussion, whether we're talking about labor supply chains or technology or whatever, it's inevitably a conversation about where does government belong? where does the private sector belong, and what's the right mix between the two to get a good result. We're focused, the book is focused on how do companies make money? What is the core business model by which they operate? And what are the human rights related consequences or risks or problems that are associated with the way they're doing business? And what should they be doing to respond to that in a way that's both allows them to be profitable, but at the same time act in a responsible way. So let me stop with that and then have a conversation.
Okay, so I'm going to open it up, and if you have a question at any point, just raise your hand. I'll find you. But there's some I guess fundamental questions that arise, and I want to get to your book specifically. And I know you and I were talking earlier, and one of the chapters is, uh, I want to get it right. When CEOs must defend democracy. And I think that's probably a somewhat relevant question at the moment. I'll kind of hold that one off
Okay.
for a second. More, your last comment about the EU and the US and the different perspectives, how to take the current administration, because we've got some work going on at the center, and we're looking at antitrust policy, and we're looking at various cases that are going on in the US. And the US is very much a ex post harm, do it through competition policy, antitrust policy. And the Europe, as you said, has moved much more towards an aggressive regulatory, kind of sectoral regulatory, kind of approach. How do those are different government engagements with the private sector. What do you think the impact of those different approaches are on how you deal with human rights issues, and how you think about that more broadly?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think even, let's sort of take it out of the context even of the Trump administration. I'll come to that in a second. Antitrust enforcement has always been quite a challenge. It's slow in coming. It does play a very useful role in making sure that you don't have one or two firms dominating a sector and eliminating the kind of healthy competition that yields a better result. But at the end of the day, a lot of things that are going on outside of a context in which antitrust or competition regulation is going to make the difference. And so I start from the view that you need to look at every industry. Each industry is different. And you need to look at what are the kind of common problems associated with the way they're doing business. And so to me, the regulatory model, if you assume, and I do, that most companies aren't going to do all that's needed without a kick in the pants. And governments, if they do it right, can be a catalyst to push companies to do that which they need to do but won't do of their own volition. And so I believe pretty strongly that there is a value in governments thinking about regulation in this global context where you have the governance gap. The biggest industrial states are the home to the largest companies, ought to be trying to figure out what's missing. What are companies in an industry not doing? Even a competitive industry where you have multiple players, but they're all operating with the same business model. How do you basically get them to begin to think more broadly about their responsibility in a supply chain or whatever it is? How do you get them to think this is actually part of what we must do, not just what we could do or should do because of antitrust regulation?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that we're ex post with antitrust. Europe is more ex ante with sectoral regulation, kind of setting up standards, codes of conduct, behavioral requirements. And it's not clear to me how human rights play into the development of those regulations, or if at all, or if they do.
Well, again, This is a work in progress. I think it's probably fair to say, I was in Europe a few weeks ago talking to some people in France and Germany about how the EU is progressing. And to say the least, it's a bumpy road. They haven't figured it out. They're not very good at it. But the instinct is right to me, which is that you begin to look at how do companies operate sector by sector, and what are the things that are inherently, if you're running a supply chain, let's say for manufacturing, or you're running a company that's doing mining in countries, again, where governance is a problem, what are the things inherent in what you're doing? So let's take mining as an example. We've been looking at cobalt mining in the Congo. 80% of the world's cobalt is in the Congo. About 20% of that is in what are called artisanal mines. They're informal mines. There are 25,000 kids working in these informal mines. Mine safety is a huge challenge. And so at the end of the day, the big buyers of cobalt, and they tend to be auto companies or electronics firms, obviously battery manufacturers, they need to be thinking about how do you deal with this sector involving tens, hundreds of thousands of people who are wandering onto these mine sites with a shovel, digging a hole in the ground, and sending their 8-year-old kids down the tunnel, which is collapsing. That's a societal problem, but one that business and the industry, the auto industry or the electronics firms, are capable of having influence on. They're not doing enough. And so there needs to be, and this is where the regulation comes in, there needs to be some look at the supply chain for those auto companies that are buying batteries that include cobalt. Germans have a supply chain law. They've just suspended it again, waiting for this European due diligence requirement to come into place. But in 2 years, there's going to be a directive from the European Union to all 27 members of the European Union. You need to be looking at environmental and social issues, including labor rights, human rights, and figuring out how do you regulate that kind of behavior. I could give you lots of examples, but it's pretty clear that there's not enough being done. Left to their own devices, companies are going to say that's risky, it's costly, it's not really our business. We don't own the mine, we don't own the factory, we don't own the farm. It's somebody else's problem. It's everybody's problem, and it's particularly those that are making their profits on the basis of a globalized economy where they're playing a role.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit on this topic. And
Sure.
it's like, how do I think about a global governance system that manages these kinds of supply chain issues effectively? And the reason I ask that is, if I'm a businessman and I have a due diligence requirement where I have to go look at my supply chain and I have certain requirements of how I deal with that supply chain, and my competitor doesn't have that same requirement, I may think it's the right thing to do, but I feel like I'm putting myself at a competitive disadvantage. So what kind of global governance systems might exist or could be developed to kind of provide, what businessmen always worry about? I want to, they never say, I want favorable regulation. They say, I want a level playing field. Right? I want a level playing field. How do I think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I want to come back here to what John Ruggie did at this school, to set up a kind of a broad framework,
Right.
through the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. He did that in 2011. It opened the field for discussion. It said companies have some responsibility. And then that evolved to this notion of each company ought to figure out, do due diligence to figure out what are the risks. That's not enough. And what you're suggesting is exactly right. We need to get to a place, this is where I think the discussion is going, ought to go, where in each industry, you get those competitors to drop their competitive juices and say, there are certain standards that apply to all of us. We're going to develop metrics. We're going to all be evaluated in the same way. and there's going to be some measure of accountability. So the example I'll give, I have a chapter in the book on this, is the Fair Labor Association, which was created in the Clinton administration, 1996, at a moment where there was a lot of commotion about sweatshop practices in apparel factories. So the president, Clinton, and Robert Reich, the labor secretary, brought in some of the biggest apparel companies, Nike and Reebok and Liz Claiborne and PVH, et cetera, unions, NGOs, and universities. And we spent 6 months developing 9 labor standards. That's the industry standard. Now, 40 companies, 112 brands are part of that system. Standards and then metrics. There probably are 150 metrics. So we say non-discrimination. We've decided that a factory that says to a woman coming in applying for a job, you're not allowed to be pregnant, that's a violation that's a discriminatory provision. So we say you can't do that. So the 40 companies, the 112 brands, are now going out to their suppliers and saying, we're a member of the Fair Labor Association. Our industry is now saying you can't do that. And then there's a way to evaluate that. And we have a process, an ongoing process, where these big companies are being assessed, not only in terms of their internal practices or policies, but performance. What are they actually doing? And there is a notion that some of those companies are not up to snuff. They're not actually seriously doing this, and they get suspended, and a few cases have been removed. That's the model. And it's now been applied, beginning to apply to agriculture, L'Oreal, Nespresso, big companies are involved. This is what I see the European regulatory system beginning to do. It needs to be industry specific. You need competitors at the table, and you need to have a sense that it's really not just every company making up for themselves what due diligence is or what feels right to them. There has to be, as you say, a level playing field and clarity about what they're being expected to do.
So if I think about what social institutions can drive that, and I'm going to simplify it vastly, but you've got government institutions,
Right.
and then you have self-regulation of some sort. Right. So in the US, you have FINRA, and FINRA kind of is the industry self-regulatory body, but it's very rigorous. It sets standards and requirements. Do you think industry is actually capable of developing uniform standards that they agree to as a self-regulatory mechanism, or do you think they really need the government and some unified, like a UN, group to kind of provide the? It's probably a mixture of two, but
it's a mixture of both. And my thinking has evolved on that. I wouldn't have predicted 25 years ago when the Fair Labor Association was created that you would get as much buy-in from as many companies to a serious process. Is it good enough? I'm not sure. But it's certainly better than almost anything I've seen in a multi-stakeholder model where it's not just industry doing it, it's industry and there's a board of 6 companies, 6 NGOs, 6 universities. Oxfam is on the board. So Oxfam is sitting there saying to Nike or to Nespresso, you're not doing enough. There's a constant tension around that table, which is to me a healthy thing.
right.
There's a certain level of trust, but there's also a sense where you sit. They say where you sit depends on where you stand. And so you've got Oxfam and companies coming to the table with very different expectations. I lean now in the direction of saying it's very hard to replicate that. That was a moment in time, a particular industry. I tried to do that with the tech sector. They really feel that they're the smartest people on earth. They're libertarian. They've never seen a regulation or any effort that's going to constrain the way they operate. So I think government really has to play a role there. And I think we're going to move in that direction. But again, it can't be government telling companies what to do without companies having a seat at the table in helping to figure out what are those standards, what are the rules, and having some sense of buy-in. Government alone can't do it. Government are not going to ever play that role without companies being a party.
I do want to make sure people, if you have questions, I know you have to leave a little early, but we'll start in the back and then come forward. Just if you do a few requirements, I think most of our students are completely familiar with this given the forum, but if you could just identify who you are and remember that your question ends with a question mark. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Posner, for being here. My name is Geraldine Arias. I'm from Nicaragua, and I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. I want to link the topic of your talk with the current state of affairs of democracy. And I wanted to ask whether you think that a different set of rules is required. I think the rules you lay out or the modus operandi works assuming that we have democracies, that government is responsive to citizens' interests, with a wave of backsliding when it comes to democracy in different regions of the world. We would expect less of that responsiveness of government to citizens. So something's missing because governments don't need citizens' support to survive. Where will that pressure come from if civil society organizations and human rights groups are then sidelined or have less input and ability or levers vis-a-vis governments? And how do you see that changing?
Yeah. I'm going to give you a different answer than I would have given you 6 months ago. I proudly served in the U.S. government. I would have said the U.S. government is part of the solution or part of the answer as a country with a democratic structure and tradition that is pushing for U.S.-based companies to be part of the answer and pushing governments like the government of Nicaragua to do the right thing. We have clearly slid backwards very quickly in the new administration, and I'm glad to talk about that. But there's a huge challenge to democracy here, which is making this conversation so much different. I wrote this book, finished it almost a year ago. I would write a different chapter on the government's role in today. We have a transactional model. We have a government. I call this a five-alarm fire. The government of the Trump administration is not, to say the least, prioritizing human rights and democracy. And it's undermining the rule of law. It's undermining virtually every institution that helps make democracy vital. So I have no doubt that we have a crisis here. But at the same time, as I said, there's the gap. The Atlantic Ocean just got wider and deeper. And so you have European governments, the Germans, the Swiss, the French, and the British, that are really looking at these issues in a very different way. And I think part of what I see as a way forward here is for those governments that do have a strong democratic tradition, do care about these issues, making sure that those doing business in their countries need to abide by a set of standards. Germans can't tell us what to do, but they can tell American companies that want to do business in Germany what to do. And so that's where I see this heading. But we at the same time have a lot of work to do to bring back and restore our democracy, to maintain a constructive role in that discussion.
So we have here, and then Evelyn will find you.
Hi, my name is Ana. I am also a mid-career student from Brazil. I have two related questions. The first one is, what conditions or incentives need to be in place for companies to sit at the table and at least be willing to negotiate with the government in terms of how to comply or create standards for human rights in their supply chains? And the second question is about monitoring and accountability, because self-reporting usually is not the most effective way of assessing if a company is complying or not. Is there something more precise or more effective in order to monitor their compliance?
Let me take the second question first on monitoring. I agree with you that self-reporting by companies tends to be quite insufficient. It's often the case that a company will find, Price Waterhouse or Ernst & Young, whoever is doing their financial accounting, they'll say, by the way, would you do us a favor, or we'll pay you to do social monitoring, to look at factories. There's not a lot of incentive for Ernst & Young or Price Waterhouse to come back and say, you got a mess on your hands, certainly if it's going to be made public. And so I think we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to make monitoring, give it more integrity. Again, I'll come back to the Fair Labor Association. We accredit monitors in every country. So somebody in Brazil, somebody in Indonesia. Price Waterhouse came to us at the beginning and said, we can do the whole wide world. And we said, what do you know about, harassment in Brazil? They didn't know anything about it. And so we said to them, thanks, but no thanks. So I think there is a growing sophistication in how monitoring is done. But the key, which is implicit in your question, is if the companies are directing it and paying for it, we're not as likely to get an honest assessment of what's going on. Second thing about monitoring is that it tends to be, there's a fatigue, because a lot of companies have said, we're going to just keep monitoring factories over and over again in the same places. They keep finding the same problems. And so one of the questions for me always is, how do you go from monitoring and audits to actually finding the remedy? We're spending too much time on a kind of rote exercise where companies all say, oh, we're okay, we monitor. And then what happens the day after? So that's a bigger conversation, but I think it's a really important one. On why companies come to the table with governments, there are different reasons. One is that they're being regulated. Why do drug companies go to the Food and Drug Administration? Because they have to. Why did Boeing stop flying the 737s? Because the Federal Aviation Administration said they're not safe. You have to ground them until you fix the problem. That's a useful model to me. It's always a model that creates tension, because essentially the regulated industry always feels the regulators are stepping on their innovation or whatever. And there's some back and forth that's necessary. Regulators can overdo it, but it's a good thing to have. So the first thing is, if you have a regulatory system that's real, the odds are there's going to be some constraint on companies, and they're going to feel that. Second thing to say, which I'm keen on as a kind of an alternate to that, or another way of looking at this, is that governments can also provide incentives to do the right thing. So let me give you an example, going back to cobalt. In the Biden administration, I tried to get the White House to convene the big car companies, the electronics firms, to begin thinking about this this informal sector, the ASM, and to formalize those sites, to invest in formalizing the site, put a fence, have guards, give protective equipment, all of which has been done on a trial basis in one mine site, and it worked. What companies came to me to say was, that's an added cost. And I said, why doesn't the government incentivize people to do the right thing? We have the Inflation Reduction Act. Why don't we put some money behind people who are going to go to the Congo or go to Zambia, where the processing, some of it's done, and basically give people incentives, tax incentives or financial incentives directly. Inflation Reduction Act is meant to bring jobs back to the United States. So I said to them, can't we walk and chew gum at the same time? Let's look for ways to incentivize the right behavior. The government can be a resource. Again, that's not going to happen in the Trump administration, to be sure, but I think it's part of the process. So it's regulation, hold the stick, hold companies accountable, and also provide the kinds of resources the government can to be a catalyst for companies to do the right thing. There's another question.
Thank you, Professor Posner, for being here. I'm Avleen. I'm a first-year Master's in Public Policy student. I'm curious, you mentioned a lot from the governments and regulators perspective, but what is the understanding of the human rights nomenclature from the businesses side, just from their leadership perspective? Because I've heard that it's typically like it's not a concern unless there is a violation. So is it even top of mind? And is there universal understanding of what the rights frameworks are, especially for United States or like European companies?
Yeah, so that's sort of what you just described is correct. And it's part of why I wrote this book and why I'm visiting 15 or 16 business schools, because I think it needs to be human rights issues, and a practical discussion of human rights needs to be incorporated into business education for the next generation of leaders. I deal with a lot of business leaders who are in crisis. Something has happened, there's a reputational crisis, they're called out, and they say, I hear this all the time, boy, I wish I had taken a course in human rights. I wish there was somebody in the company who had some expertise. We're making it up as we go along. We're in the 21st century. We're in a globalized economy. These are the issues that keep senior leaders up at night. Environmental, human rights issues. Economists call these externalities, and they sort of say, well, this is not central to how you're making money. Well, it may not be in a traditional sense how you're making money, but I think it is part of the package of how you're making money. You know, Nike's has 5% of its workforce in Beaverton, Oregon. 95% of the people who work for Nike don't get a paycheck from Nike, but they're operating in factories in Asia or Latin America, and they are making Nike profitable. And so to me, the answer for the future is these ought to be business priorities. We need more data, we need more analysis, but businesses need internally to say, again, either because regulation is coming, see Europe, or because it's the right thing to do, or because, and I can make a longer term case, you're going to recruit the best people to come work for you, you're going to have better retention rates, you're going to have greater productivity if you're taking these issues seriously. That's the conversation I have with the most enlightened companies, but I share your frustration, which is in your voice, that a lot of companies would rather pretend these issues are not their issues. We're still there for a majority of companies. Let's keep our head down and say these are not the things, these are not material to our business. There's a lot of words that have cropped up in the corporate speak and the legal speak that suggest these are things that are out of bounds. I think we need to bring them into the center and say, these are priorities as much as productivity or worker retention or efficiency or profitability. This is what the world needs now, is the mix profit with responsibility.
I guess I have a small bias. I need to like weigh
Go
in
for it.
on this a little bit. One of the things, look, I was in the private sector for 20 some years. One of the things that businesses are really good at, they internalize benefits and they externalize costs, right? And if I can get away with externalizing costs, yes, there are some moral boundaries and all of that, but if I can push those costs off, that's a benefit to my company, right? And unless, in my view, unless the government kind of steps in some forms, provides the guardrails, if you will, in terms of not allowing those costs to be externalized, whether it's to other people or other societies, social issues like environmental problems, you know, that's a reasonable approach. I mean, it's kind of obvious. I hate to say it, economist kind of 101, you know, kind of approach of you internalize the externalities in some way. And there has to be a mechanism or a set of mechanisms to do that. And I think that's true for some social issues, not like human rights. I mean, not just traditional environmental kinds of issues. You had a question.
Right. So my name is Mohammad Ayaz. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the South Asia Institute. My work has been, again, in the similar area, focusing on governance and human rights and sustainability issues, and mainly in the apparel industry. So I have two questions. One, you mentioned about FLA, and I worked with them on the ground in Pakistan and Bangladesh in the apparel industry. and it's a quite an excellent kind of arrangement. But so far, we have seen that the progress or the improvements that it have brought on is still, of course, limited because there are not everybody is on the table. So there are brands who join the initiative, but then they leave as well. So it means that there is something more, something extra that is needed, that is going to push a larger number of brands to be on the table, and then maybe some significant change can happen. So what do you think? What else can be done which can support, of course, this excellent initiative? So this is one question. The other thing is about, since I worked a lot on the ground in Pakistan and Bangladesh, so we have seen that you said that companies needs to be on the table on this side of the value chain, but there are firms on the other side of the value chain, the suppliers, right? So many times the kind of standards, the kind of solutions that are brought in for addressing the issues on the ground, that sometimes they're not in sync with what is happening on the ground. And something you are suggesting here might not translate well on the ground. And sometimes there are, or maybe sometimes it leads to some sort of unintended consequences that do more harm rather than the good. And there are a lot of examples that we have seen. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So I've become increasingly focused on the relationship between global buyers and local suppliers, which is your second question. I'm going to go to that first. About 7 years ago, we started looking at purchasing practices. What are the ways in which a global buyer, and again, let's take the apparel industry. How does a global buyer, how do they relate to their suppliers? Are there things that could be done differently? Are there things that could be done that are revenue neutral? So I want to satisfy John and his, what he's raised about what companies are thinking about. We spent 2 years talking to 80 global brands and suppliers, and we came up with 13 metrics for buyer-supplier relations. In the pre-production, you design a product. Do you consult with those who are going to actually be producing it to see, is it actually easy to produce, or is there something that can be done to change that? In the production, you decide that you don't like, the world is not liking the color green. So midstream, you say, we want it yellow, or the date changes. We need this. We said October 15th, we really needed September 15th. And in post-production, how quickly do the suppliers get paid? All of those things are potentially revenue neutral, although you could say delaying payment is going to help the buyers. Everybody we talk to in the CSR world, the sustainability world, within companies, said these are fantastic. We brought a group together in Hong Kong. Wild enthusiasm for this. These things would really make a difference. It would make a difference in the lives of the suppliers, and at the end of the day, it's the workers that are going to get. It's affecting the workers. You have a change of date for the order. All of a sudden, you're working 18-hour days, working 6 days a week to make sure that Walmart's happy that they're getting it on time. We went then to those companies, the buyers, and said, we want to try these out. In every case except for one, the people doing purchasing, the operations people, said, why should we do these things? We don't collect this information. Why should we collect? It doesn't affect us. We can change the order. The supplier needs us more than we need them. We can go somewhere else. We don't own the factory. We got one company, a very big European company, said, okay, we're going to try it out, but only do 7 of your 13. We waited a year. They said, actually, we can only do 3. And then a year later, they came back and said, we're going to try to do 2, but we actually don't have the data. That's insane to me. That's a reflection of the system. Again, we can talk about markets and motives and all that. If you're serious about trying to protect workers, you can take a look at things that are revenue neutral, where if you just were a little more considerate about the way you operated, you could relieve the pressure on the supplier and help the worker, and it wouldn't affect the bottom line. So I think there's room, a lot of room to do things like that. And we just need to be introducing that into the culture of a global supply chain. This is part, again, of the rules of the road. We need rules of the road where people are saying, you know what, there's things we can do better. It's not going to affect the bottom line, or in a minimal way it will, but it's the right thing to be doing. That's my push. We can be profitable, companies be profitable, but also responsible. Your first question is, what do you do about Walmart or Amazon or Shein or Temu? You know, we keep going. We go from mom and pop stores to Macy's to Walmart to Amazon, and now we've got Shein. Shein is at the bottom of the food chain, as far as I'm concerned. They've made a judgment. They're going to produce things unbelievably cheaply, and the workers are going to suffer. And so I don't know how you regulate them. That's a question. And even on these tariffs, there's been a question of whether they sneak in because they're doing it all direct mailing. There's no middleman. They don't own a store. So we've got, again, I would say governments need to be really trying to figure out, how do you prevent a company like Shein from basically taking advantage of an unregulated global space and putting workers in stress. I'm not a fan of Shein, in case you haven't heard.
So, you know, often I kind of think of these issues when I think about what's the role of the corporation in addressing some of these social issues, right? And, you know, I do believe actually markets are quite powerful ways to allocate resources, and they have failings. And so if you're a firm, it seems to me your responsibility is you know, the business of business is business, right? And so they do have to deliver performance. They have to, you know, deliver high quality goods and services. They have to have strong, sustained economic growth and profitability, and they need to have sound risk management. At the same time, my view is they should be operating with high integrity, right? And the obvious high integrity means that, you know, robust adherence to the spirit and letter of formal financial and legal requirements. That seems like a minimum threshold. The hard questions are the ones like, when should a firm go beyond kind of the requirements, if you will, the regulations embedded in law or whatever? When should a firm go beyond that? What are in your mind, you know, and this is a completely unfair question, but what are some of the moral thresholds that if they're crossed, they should be addressed? And I know you and I were talking about, I don't know if you want to talk about the Georgia voting rights law as an example. I don't know if people know it. We may want to explain what it is, but how should I think about that if I'm a CEO? What are the moral thresholds?
So I want to answer that in two ways. And the first way is that, you know, I've been talking in this hour about, you know, government regulation, European due diligence, and all of that. My anxiety about that and about government regulation in any instance is that you set a rule, you set a line, and then companies' response is, we will set up a compliance division, we will set the lawyers to work, and they will tell us exactly what we have to do and how to walk to the line. And walking to the line may not solve the problem. So one of the challenges for any regulator and anybody who's advocating for that is to think about how you move companies from a technical compliance mentality. We have to do this. We can't cross the line, but we're going to get chalk on our boots. We're going to walk right to the line and do what we have to do and nothing more. That is a huge challenge for regulators. Second answer, and it goes to the Georgia law. goes back to something, I have a chapter in the book, and I basically take a quite conservative view on corporate leaders weighing in on social and political issues. If you're running a big company, the odds are you have people whose political views, social views run across a spectrum. So if you're talking about LGBT rights or reproductive rights or guns, you're going to have people who absolutely don't agree with each other. And as a CEO of a big company, you're going to have to deal with that complexity of your workforce. And so I say, be careful. Don't, and once you weigh in on one thing, then somebody's going to come and say, you talked about this, why not this issue that I care about? The one exception, and it's a really important exception, is when the core democratic norms are being challenged. And so I talk in the book about the 2020 election, where there were significant efforts to prevent people from voting in the state of Georgia. And a couple of big business leaders, Ken Chenault, who was for 17 years the CEO of American Express, Ken Fraser, who was at Merck for many years as the CEO. They came together and they organized a group of business leaders, and they said, this is consequential enough to our democracy, which underlies our success financially and the success of the business sector. To have a democratic society will give us a better shot at being successful. We have a 250-year experiment in the United States rooted in Constitution, rooted in strong institutions that support democracy. And so if I were writing that today, the Georgia example to me is interesting, but we've gone so much farther than that. And so I worry, I think now, and I'm saying this here, but I'm saying it to business leaders, we need collective action by every institution in this country that matters. What Harvard did a few days ago is a really important example of an institutional leader standing up and saying no. Our institutions, whether it's educational, business, religious, the military, science, they're big institutions that are being threatened, each in their own way, but they need to go beyond their immediate self-interest and look at what's happening to the society. We will not go another 250 years as an exemplar, as a strong, healthy society where business can thrive if we don't challenge some of these assaults. And I really feel I've said it's a 5-alarm fire. We're in a place that I've never seen. And I think it's incumbent on leaders in any of these big, strong institutions to come together collectively, figure out what can we do and what are our red lines. One of the things I'm saying to business leaders is, let's not focus just on what's already happened. Let's anticipate what's coming. We are somewhere in the realm of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month from the federal government saying, we're going to ignore a court order from the Supreme Court. What do we do then? Is that a red line? Is that the point you say something? We are going to have a debate about whether or not the election in 2022 is being conducted fairly. People are actually getting a right to choose candidates and people to represent them. We have a debate now that I never would have guessed about whether or not president can serve a third term. I don't know what the right categories are, but things like that have not happened, I think it's really important for big institutions to say, when that happens, we're in a different place and we're going to speak out. So I'm encouraging that. I think it's really important. And again, I think in the educational realm, Harvard has led the way, and other schools I hope will follow.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Harvard's response is, obviously, this is a set of issues that go directly to the operation of Harvard.
Right, that's right.
Right. But one of the things that Harvard had done prior to this was to step back and say, we will not take strong positions on social issues that don't affect the operation of the institution. I understand that. I mean, there's the Kelvin report out of the University of Chicago from decades ago that kind of laid out a similar kind of approach. And I think that's a general approach that we've had now for the last 6 months or so. But this is starting to cross that line from a social issue into something that affects the operation. But interestingly to me, it has massive social implications as well.
It does.
And we'll see how that plays out. You had another question?
And I will say, where the mic's going over there, I think the notion of neutrality has to be, we've sort of busted through that with this administration. I think we're at a place now where we have to take a different approach.
Hi, my name is Thames. I'm Master Public Policy student here. So far, we have talked about the business and the government. I want to know, I want to hear your thought about the consumer as well, particularly on the consumer like activisms. So how successful has that been in changing the firm behaviors, and how much actually consumer needs to do to achieve the goal and kind of like get into the CEO's mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm glad you're raising it. I want to say something about consumers and also about investors. We haven't really talked about them. They're kind of critical here. I would love to think that consumers are going to be a driver of change in this area. And I think they can be, but I think it's premature. A lot of companies will say consumers don't care. They want lower price, or they like a different style. These issues don't matter. I don't believe that. Not everybody, but I think there is a group of consumers that care and would like to do the right thing. They want to walk in a store and see Coke and Pepsi. Coke gets an 8 and Pepsi gets a 3. They're both selling soda water. It's more or less the same cost. They'll go with the company that gets the better rating. The problem is we don't have that rating because we don't have data. Again, there's something called Pearson's Law, which says that which is measured improves, that which is measured and made public improves exponentially. We don't have, Walmart can tell you to the can of green beans, how many green beans were sold in Topeka, Kansas in the last hour. They may not even know where those green beans were canned. And so what we need, and this comes back to government regulation, we need to have an enforcement of companies to basically develop the data that will allow us to give consumers the information they need to make informed purchasing decisions. I take it from the environmental sector. There's a terrific group called the Environmental Defense Fund. In the 1980s or early 90s, they took basically government mandated data on clean air and clean water, and they put it through a process that they called the scorecard, where you could go online and punch in your zip code, and it would tell you who are the biggest producers of benzene in your neighborhood. Within 6 months, the chemical industry in the United States changed because consumers, the public, was able to evaluate who are the companies with the most benzene in their neighborhood. We need that on human rights, on things like labor supply chains. We need to have real data. Companies rely on data for everything that's important, but data on how they're doing human rights, not so available. And so that once we get that, I think there will be consumers, again, not everybody, but a significant number of consumers that are going to drive the train. One last quick thought on investors, if I can. Investors are also part of the problem, as far as I'm concerned, because they have for 50 years followed the dictate of Milton Friedman, who says, really what's important is maximizing shareholder returns, and they've taken it to mean in the next 3 months. That almost by definition means that the things that I'm pushing for aren't going to happen. And so we need to get to a place, we've written a report in our center about this, where you give consumers who are investors, the public, again, not everybody, but some, honest to God ratings of environmental and social issues. We have ESG ratings, $30 trillion. Really, it's evaluating risk to investors, not to people or the planet. So we've suggested tear apart the E and the S and really do a serious analysis with data of who are the best 20 manufacturing companies with regard to carbon emissions or treatment of workers, and make those turn those into funds that are the real ESG. We call them ESG values funds. And for not everybody, but people, not for pension funds, but for people with wealth, family offices, foundations, let there be a way in which the best companies are rewarded by socially aware, conscious investors who are saying, I want to only invest in those companies that are actually doing the best on environment, on social, on diversity, whatever it is. So we're going to get there on this. It's very hard. I went to one of the big 3 or 4 investment firms that has trillions of dollars and said, why don't you do this? And they said, well, we won't do it because then they'll know our other ESG funds are bullshit. We need to move away from that. We need some alternatives for people who are willing to take a lesser return and reward the companies that are doing the best.
So that's a particular set of investors that have a social conscience.
That's right.
Want to be able to invest
Yeah.
in funds that do that. The one thing I would say on the investor side is if you take the 4 largest firms investment firms, BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard, and State Street, they control about 40% of the equity markets. And so they could obviously have significant impact. Larry Fink at BlackRock has spoken out about this extensively, but it's, to Mike's point, it's not a sense of doing the socially good thing necessarily. It may be a bit of that, but it's also trying to take a long-term view, because if you think about where their money comes from, the bulk of it is pension funds. Okay, so it's all of your money going into pension funds, and they need to take a long-term perspective. So they want a sustainable system, economic system that's going to continue to grow. And when you have that mindset, you start to align the incentives of these firms, because they don't want to invest in coal companies if they feel like coal is there's going to have to be some addressing of the risks from burning coal, right? So they look at it. The incentives are aligned at some level a bit in terms of they're taking a long-term view, trying to think of sustainable firms that can grow profitably over that time. So there's a little bit of blending of the incentives in a positive way in my mind. And then you've got the group that Mike's talking about who really do care about it more and are willing to take maybe a lesser return or something like that. So, all right. I want to thank everybody for coming. And thank Mike for spending the time with us. We do have, first of all, say thanks to Mike.